Good evening. I'm Sandy Landman from the Friends of the East Brunswick Environmental Commission, and I'd like to welcome everybody to our first Option Green program of 2023, which is presented by the Friends in partnership with the East Brunswick Library. And here tonight with me also is Lidi Haramati, who is our Vice President. She's sitting in front of our great logo with the salamander. So I want to tell you a little bit about what the Friends do before we get started and what's coming up. So mark your calendars. Spring Free Cycling Day is coming up on Saturday, April 22nd, which is Earth Day at the Community Arts Center. And we always need adult volunteers, and it's a lot of fun. So we'll be posting a volunteer sign-up form soon on our website, and we'll let people know also on our Facebook group. So stay tuned for that. Our other activities coming up include National Moth Week, which was started right here in East Brunswick 11 years ago, and it's now a worldwide citizen science project. And this year, National Moth Week takes place July 22nd to 30th, and we'll be planning a moth night, I'm sure, during that time. And you can learn more about that at nationalmothweek.org. Other activities include the Salamander Protection Program, which was covered by WPIX TV just a few weeks ago, and the Community Garden, which is sold out for this season already, but stay tuned because we do let people know when there are plots available. We also participate in the Sustainability Task Force here in East Brunswick, and you can become informed about our events by joining our mailing list at friendsebec.com, and we never sell or share your email address. So please join us and join our mailing list. Now on with the show. I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker, Danielle Brown, who's going to be talking about the whales of New York and New Jersey. And you know, whales have been in the news quite a bit lately, not for all good reasons, but she's going to tell us all about that. Danielle's currently a PhD candidate in ecology and evolution at the Rutgers School of Environmental and Biological Sciences down the road. She earned her bachelor's degree at Stockton University, where she majored in biology and minored in marine science. She also holds a master's degree from George Mason University in Virginia and in environmental science and policy. Danielle serves on the as Director of Research for Gotham Whale on Staten Island. She'll tell you a little bit more about that in her presentation. Her current research focuses on the ecology of humpback whales who live off of New York and New Jersey, including their population characteristics and the risks that they face from vessel strike. She's going to take questions after her presentation via the chat on your Zoom screen. So put those questions in the chat, and we'll be asking and giving them to Danielle when she's completed. So now take it away, Danielle. You're on.
Thank you, Sandra. All right. Sandra, wave if you, or Lidi, wave if you could see my screen. All right. So thank you so much for that introduction. My name is Danielle Brown, like Sandra said. I am a PhD candidate at Rutgers, and I'm the Director of Research for Gotham Whale. Long before Rutgers, I was an undergrad at Stockton, where I conducted some photo ID research on bottlenose dolphins in Cape May. And after graduating, I worked as a field stranding technician at the Marine Mammal Stranding Center. And while working there, I began to realize that something was going on with humpback whales because we started to get more phone calls about them, about things like entanglements, or just more sightings were being reported. Back at this time in 2014 to 2015, people would actually call the stranding center when they saw a whale because it was so unexpected that they thought something was wrong. But we soon realized that healthy whales were feeding in unexpected places, like in Raritan Bay. So I decided that this is what the rest of my life was going to be, studying whales in New York and New Jersey. I left the Marine Mammal Stranding Center and went to graduate school at George Mason University. I focused my entire master's degree specifically on humpback whales in the New York Bight. After graduating with my master's degree, I went straight to the Rutgers PhD program in ecology and evolution. And currently, my dissertation work involves analyzing historical data on whales in the New York Bight and also collecting samples from stranded whales to analyze their foraging ecology and their stress hormone patterns. I will be presenting some of that historical data today to all. So I'm going to give a brief history of just whaling in New York and New Jersey. I'm going to be discussing what baleen species were here historically and review the data that are currently available on whales. We'll talk about what we know about humpback whales today and discuss potential anthropogenic risks. So before we get started, I just wanted to make sure that everyone is familiar with the study area. This is a map of the New York Bight. It's a triangular body of water that extends from Montauk, New York, south to Cape May, New Jersey. It's bordered at the north by Long Island and at the west by the Jersey Shore. And there are two major estuaries located within the New York Bight. You have the New York, New Jersey Harbor Estuary and the Delaware Estuary. And of course, within the New York, New Jersey Harbor Estuary lies New York City, including the borough of Manhattan. So let's go through a brief history of whaling in New York and New Jersey. I can certainly do an entire hour-long presentation on whaling in our area, but this is just a brief overview because a lot of people didn't know that whaling even took place here. So when we think of the start of commercial whaling, we often think of New England, right? But few people know that the very first whaling industry actually began along the shores of Delaware Bay in the early 1600s. The very first settlers to Cape May and Lewis, Delaware were actually whalers, and many of the beach towns that we're familiar with from Long Beach Island south to Cape May were actually named by whalers or by whaling families. Now, before the 1600s, there was some form of whaling by Native Americans, but they were basically taking advantage of dolphins and porpoises that were close to shore. But they would use any stranded animals that would wash up on the beach. So this was actually the very first form of commercial whaling where fishermen that were living along the shore would fight over whales that stranded. These were actually called drift whales. And they fought over this so much so that laws had to be put in place to define who would have ownership over these whales. But by the 1630s and 40s, whalers were actually launching boats from shore to go after live whales. The season was generally from December through April. They were mainly focused on North Atlantic right whales. And it was so important to them that children were actually even given off from school during this time, almost as an extended holiday, so they could help with the hunts. With the advancements of whaling technology, of course, ships became faster. They could stay offshore for longer. And soon it was discovered that sperm whales contained a very clean burning oil. So they became a very sought after species. The very first deep sea whaling ship left Sag Harbor in 1785. And then the first one to leave Perth Amboy, New Jersey was in 1824. So these were both very big whaling ports. I should note, though, that the destinations of these whaling ships were not in the New York Bight. They would travel as far away as the Caribbean or South America. In 1849, the very first ship from Sag Harbor actually made it all the way to the Arctic, where they were even hunting the bowhead whales up there. So as we know, the populations of whales began to decline, and by the 1860s, so did shore whale. The coastal species were too difficult to find, and the invention of petroleum was around this time as well. So whale oil was not as sought after as it used to be. So the last whaling ship left Sag Harbor in 1871, and the last whale killed by shore whalers was off Amagansett in 1918. And by this time, like I said, most populations of whales have dropped dramatically. Protections were put in place to protect whales as people began to realize that they were declining. There was a ban specifically on humpback whaling in the North Atlantic in 1955, established by the International Whaling Commission. And of course, the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act in the 1970s And then finally, an international ban on whaling input by the IWC in 1982. I should also note, by the way, that 99% of the photos in this presentation were taken by me right off New York and New Jersey. Let's see, okay. So a question that I wanted to answer was what baleen whale species were here historically, and compare that to what we're seeing today to see if there were any differences. So what I'm going to do in the next few slides is try to piece together for you a history of whales in the region and what's known about them. Now, there was very little formal research on whales in our region until recently. So most of what we know comes from opportunistic sources. Unfortunately, prior to 1970, records are very limited. We know that shore whalers had been hunting off our coastlines for centuries, and it would be fantastic if there were these detailed records of every single one of their catches, but unfortunately, that's not the case. Whaling diaries do exist, but these diaries do not often mention what species, just that a whale was caught on a specific day. So I came up with the idea to use newspapers to tell the story of what species were here. Newspapers began reporting centuries ago, and whales have always been big news. So sightings, strandings, and any catches of whales could be found in the headlines. So for the first chapter of my dissertation, I searched through digital newspaper archives for different records of different whale species in New York and New Jersey. And I searched through more than 100,000 newspaper articles. So it was quite an undertaking. And this is what I found. From 1821 to 1970, which is when the majority of the records were that I could find, the most common species were right whales and fin whales. They were definitely the most common in all newspaper records. The species that were rarely mentioned were humpback whales, minke whales, blue whales, and also sei whales, which I don't have here, but all of those species there were very, very few mentions. And if you kind of take a look at this graph here, you can see how there's a lot of green, which is right whales, and there's a lot of purple, which is fin whales. There were some sperm whale sightings too, but I'm not including that in these presentations because they're not a baleen whale. And this is an example of one newspaper article that was very helpful in my search. So it states that a right whale was taken, which means it was hunted or caught off Southampton Island on Tuesday. So I could figure out what date it was. And it even says how long it was. It measured 50 feet long. And I'm going to show you a few more interesting newspaper articles here. So these are some fun articles that I just thought were so interesting. There are so many, I could make an entire book out of all of them, but a few of these date all the way back to the 1700s, right? And I'm kind of a history buff, it runs in the family. So I think it's so neat that we could find this information out. So the first one I have here says that 2 whales appeared in the river before this city, right? And they're talking about the Delaware River. So right there, that's super interesting. There were 2 whales in the Delaware River right off Philadelphia, which is pretty far up there. So that's an interesting case. So we have another one in 1761. We hear from Amboy that 2 whales were seen near that place about a fortnight ago. I love the way they spoke back then. But Amboy is inside Raritan Bay. So we know that humpback whales go into Raritan Bay today. So it is interesting that whales back then also used the bay. We have a few others in 1742. This actually is another one of my favorites. So if in about midway through on Sunday, he saw 14 called the scrag whale, some of which he states would probably make 50 barrels of oil. So a scrag whale was the name that they gave to North Atlantic gray whales. Now, North Atlantic gray whales are no longer in existence. They went extinct in the early to mid 1700s. So the fact that there was this sighting in 1742, I think is very cool. And it was probably one of the last sightings of that species in the area. So then we do have another one here. This is one of the only mentions of a humpback whale that I found. This one is where two whales were hunted off Southampton. One was a right whale, very clear here, and the other species was called a humpback. So one of the only times that I actually found that mentioned. 1870. So that's a pretty long time ago, right? So we're looking at about 150 years ago, and we have a collision between a boat and a whale that was documented in a newspaper. So that's a very long time ago. And then finally in 1916, this is one of the earliest, if not the earliest, articles I have that had a photo in it. A whale that came into Jamaica Bay. I don't know if everyone's familiar with that. Jamaica Bay is off Queens. It's basically just east of the Narrows or the Verrazano Bridge. And this is a very clear photo of what is a finback whale that is in Jamaica Bay. So super, super interesting things that can be learned from newspaper articles. And these type of searches can even be done with any species, not just whales. Okay. So after the 1970s is when formal research really began to take place in the New York Bight. Studies found that fin and minke whales were the most common. They did find some humpback whales during this time, and in fact mentioned that they were seen regularly, but with a lot of inconsistency. So there were some years when there were a lot of them, and then there were some years when there were none. When humpback whales were seen in the summertime, were seen in the New York Bight, it was mainly in summer, but there were some winter sightings as well. The right whale at this point was no longer as common as it used to be, which makes sense. They experienced one of the longest time periods of whaling. Remember, they've been hunting right whales for since at least the late 1500s. So quite a long time. So it does make sense that at this point they were rare, but they still did see a few sightings every year. Even though they were rarely seen, it was 1 or 2 sightings a year. And this map here highlights the study area. The Sadov and Cardinal paper from 1993 is where I'm getting this information. And you can see the area throughout the New York Bight. They did not survey the coast of New Jersey, which is why we don't have information from this time about the Jersey Shore and whales, but we do know where they went. And that's going to be important in a second, and I'll explain. So up until now, humpback whales were apparently inconsistent visitors to the New York Bight. However, we do have some information from the 80s and 90s. We know that from 1985 to 1995, there was an increase in juvenile strandings along the entire mid-Atlantic. This was from New Jersey all the way south to Florida. There was also an increase in the number of humpback whales seen off Cape May, New Jersey, which actually led to the establishment of the whale watching companies that are there and still in existence today. Some short-term whaling also took place further north in New Jersey off Brielle and off Atlantic Highlands, but this was almost exclusively during the wintertime. But we do know that they saw multiple species. So they would see humpbacks, they would see fin whales, and they would also see minke whales. And every once in a while, if they got lucky, they would see a right whale. So surveys that finally took place in southern New Jersey were from 2008 to 2009. And they still found in this area fin whales to be the most common species, and they were consistent year round. They did find humpback whales. There were humpbacks in all seasons, but there were only 17 humpback whale sightings in 2 years, which really isn't a lot. They were mainly seen in winter and spring, although, like I said, there were still small numbers of sightings during the summertime. Again, the right whale, not common. When they did see them, it was between November and May, and minke whales were also not common. But when they saw the few that they saw, they were only seen in winter and spring. So now we're getting closer to present day. Now, doesn't that study area look very familiar? Very similar to the study area from the 90s by Sadov and Cardinal. And the reason why that's interesting is because we can make direct comparisons to what the studies found. So aerial surveys from 2017 to 2020 showed that humpback whales were now the most common species. Unlike the New Jersey surveys from 2008, more humpback whales were seen in this area during the summertime. So it is very possible that there have been big changes between 2008, 2009, and 2017 to 2020. Now, this map here is showing the locations of every single whale sighting during the survey, so not just humpback whales, but you can see there are lots of whales that were seen off the New York Bight. Again, here though, fin whales still very, very common. Although humpback whales rose above them, they were still one of the most common species. Right whales, again, still not common at all and mainly seen in winter and spring. This study did not look at minke whales, probably because they're a little bit difficult to spot from the air. So that brings us to today. Humpback whales are still the most commonly documented species in the New York Bight, along with fin and minke whales. And right whales do still use our area, and they're seen here every year, but in low numbers, which makes sense because there are less than 350 remaining alive today. Blue and sei whales are still very uncommon, although there are sightings and there are acoustic detections of these species as well, just not nearly as common as the others. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to focus specifically on humpback whales and what we've learned about them in our area so far. So just a quick review on the history of humpback whales, just to make sure that's sticking in your head right now. Okay. So historic records describe them as rare. They were rarely reported in newspapers, right? From 1978 to 1980, we know that they were mainly seen north of Long Island. So these were the results in this map of wide-scale surveys. These are where the humpback whale sightings were. So you have just one off eastern Long Island, but most of them are north of there. We know that there was an increase in humpback whale strandings from New Jersey south to Florida from 1985 to 1995. We know that there were, I skipped one. We know that during the 80s and 90s, they were seen in the New York Bight, even in the New York Harbor area, but there was no consistency. So this map is from Sadov and Cardinal, and they highlighted the areas where they felt were the highest likelihood of finding humpback whales. So mainly out eastern Long Island here, mainly offshore, except for close off of Montauk here. And there, you might miss it, but there's this little bit of density here inside or New York Harbor, which is interesting because we do see them in that area today as well. In the 2000s, there was an increase in humpback whales out near the shelf break. So if you look here and compare it to what we showed earlier, that they were mainly north of Long Island, you can see that they extended their distribution quite a bit south here during this time. But again, right at that shelf break near the canyons. From 2010 to 2017, there were increases in humpback whale sightings every single year from whale watching folks. You can see the increase. And if you look at 2000 here, the green is humpback whales. You can see there were quite a bit of humpback whale sightings during this time, which correlates to when they extended their southern distribution near the shelf break. So you can see that here. And then note from 2011 to 2017, you can see how every single year, basically there was an increasing trend in humpback whale sightings. And then lastly, from 2011 to 2016, there was an increase in humpback whales in the New York, New Jersey harbor estuary area, which is which is where New York Harbor is located. We even had multiple sightings up the Hudson River. All right, so humpback whales are still seen consistently every year in the New York Bight, but mainly during spring, summer, and fall, with the exception of this past winter, where we have had lots of humpback whale sightings this winter. On the left is a map of humpback whale sightings collected from 2011 to 2023, mainly from whale watching boats, but there's a few in there from the general public. And on the right, you have a map of humpback whale locations from those aerial surveys. So you can see that the green is spring, the yellow is summer, the orange is fall, and the blue is winter. We see all four colors on the map, so they were seen in all seasons. Although the summertime is when we see the larger squares, which means larger groups. So lots of large groups of humpback whales offshore, and we also see lots of sightings inshore in all of those seasons. Now, you can see here that the aerial surveys on the right are mainly focused on New York waters, again, out to the shelf break. They don't really focus on New Jersey waters, although there were a few off effort. So it's nice to have the opportunistic data coming from the whale watching boats that kind of fills in the gaps a little bit of where the aerial surveys don't go. So the rest of my talk will be focused on the humpback whale population in the northwestern portion of the New York Bight, which is also called the apex. I'm the director of research for an organization called Gotham Whale. And Gotham Whale is a nonprofit research, education, and advocacy organization that collects data on whales and dolphins and even seals in New York and New Jersey. So back in 2011, Gotham Whale partnered with American Princess Cruises in New York. And the American Princess wanted to start a whale watching business, and Gotham Whale wanted to research the whales. So we began collecting data on board their whale watching trips. So we're about to begin our 13th season now, and we've received data contributions from 10 different whale watching vessels in the New York and New Jersey area. About 10% of our data comes from the general public who see whales out on the water and they visit our website to fill out our sighting form. But by far, the vast majority of our data does come directly from the whale watching boats. With all of these data, we've learned so much about humpback whales in New York and New Jersey. Gotham Whale has really been the only group that has been collecting data consistently since 2011. On the right here, this gives you an idea of our typical study area. So these are vessel tracks from just one of our whale watching boat contributors. We do now collect data on trips that go further offshore, even out to Hudson Canyon, but just a few trips every year. So this is our typical study area. We have a lot of coverage here. We are trying to expand our coverage though, further south, further offshore, so we can learn as much as we can about these offshore and more southern humpback whales. So what is a humpback whale? Humpback whales are baleen whales. They can grow up to 60 feet long. They can weigh up to 40 tons. They can also live upwards of 90 years. They have very unique features, including pectoral flippers that extend to about 1/3 of their body length. There are many populations of humpback whales around the world. And the population in the western, or that the western North Atlantic whales belong to, is called the West Indies population. This population is no longer considered to be endangered. They were removed from the endangered species list several years ago. But keep in mind, all whales are still federally protected. Humpback whales undergo extensive migrations between feeding and breeding grounds. They have a very complex population structure, which makes it difficult to answer many of the questions that we have. The reason why it's difficult is because in the Western North Atlantic, there's one main feeding ground, but there are one main breeding ground down in the Caribbean, but multiple feeding grounds. So each one of those feeding grounds is genetically distinct because whales return to the same one over and over again. And mothers also bring their calves back to their respective feeding ground. So the whales that we're seeing in New York and New Jersey are actually outside of the typical feeding areas for the species. The feeding season is generally from spring through fall. And during the winter, most of the population is down on the breeding grounds. Another unique feature of humpback whales, of course, is their tail flukes. They are unique to the individual, just like a fingerprint, and they can be used to re-site the animal at a different time or in a different location. We can then calculate different metrics based on their sighting history. In the short term, their dorsal fins can also be used to identify the individual, but not everyone catalogs dorsal fins. Gotham Whale catalogs both flukes and dorsal fins. So by analyzing our catalog and the sighting histories of every individual from 2012 to 2018, we figured out that about 50% of our whales were seen more than once in the New York Bight apex area. The average time in the area was 37.6 days, but that range was anywhere from only 2 days all the way up to 140 days within one season. We also found that many of these resident whales return in consecutive years. The average was 2 years, but at least 2 whales were documented in 5 different years during this study. Now, because this analysis ended in 2018, we do know that our calculations are probably a bit longer now. To determine what feeding population these humpback whales belong to and where they've been before, we shared a subset of our catalog with other areas that also catalog humpback whales. We're very lucky that there is such extensive humpback whale research throughout the Western North Atlantic. So these are all of the catalogs and the locations that we compared to. We found that about 40% of the humpback whales we see belong to the Gulf of Maine feeding population, and around 4% belong to the Eastern Canada population. We found that most whales were juveniles when they were first seen in the New York Bight apex. But it gets more complicated than that, because since whales keep returning year after year, some of them are now considered as adults. We don't know why these whales still visit our area when the rest of the adult population is up north on the feeding grounds or down south on the breeding grounds. We do see some older adults, but usually this is during fall when they've already begun to migrate. And when we see the older adults, they're almost always seen only once and never seen again. We also learned that some of our whales move around the New York Bight quite a bit. So many of the individuals we've seen in the New York Bight apex around New York City were seen in Cape May, New Jersey, and also out east in Montauk, New York. So they might actually spend a lot more time than we think they do in the area. So what we originally called the New York City Humpback Whale catalog is now becoming more like the New York Bight catalog, since we have expanded our efforts so much. The catalog now has 303 individual humpback whales in it. We identify between 50 and 90 whales every year. And why is it important for us to do this? Because it's a cost-effective way of studying the lives of these whales. Whale research is incredibly expensive. The average project can cost hundreds of thousands and thousands of dollars, but photo identification like this does not cost much at all. Also, cataloging helps to monitor the health of these animals. For example, sometimes a whale with a fishing gear entanglement is disentangled, and the team wants to know if the animal survived or they want to know how the injury is healing. Well, we've been able to document that information by keeping track of individuals. We can also document the last known sighting of that animal before it got entangled in an attempt to try to figure out where or when it happened. The whale in the photo here is a great example. It became famous in 2020 when it was actually anchored to the seafloor in trawl gear off Rockaway, New York. It nearly drowned. That whale was in our catalog. So we had the last known sighting before it became entangled. And we saw it again after it was rescued, and it was alive and healthy and feeding. So the rescue team was really interested in that information. Now, another important part of our job is to identify stranded whales. This is certainly not a fun part of our job at all, but it needs to be done in order to determine how long that whale may have been in the New York, New Jersey area and potentially where it was before it died. This information can support efforts to determine where it happened, when it happened, with possible prevention. So I have a few interesting case studies here that I just wanted to tell you about. So the first one is NYC 0011, or number 11. So this whale was first seen in the New York Bight Apex in 2013. And we know that it was born in 2011. So the reason why we know that is because of a long-standing collaboration with the Gulf of Maine Humpback Whale catalog. They had photographed this whale in its calf year. So born in 2011, we saw it for the first time when it was 2 years old. And this whale has been seen every single year since, with the exception of 2016. So we have now seen this whale in 9 different years. So that would make it technically an adult. We also know that this whale does have a healed over propeller injury. Now, this injury was on the whale in 2013 when we first documented it. So we know it had to have happened sometime between 2011 and 2013. And what's really interesting about this animal is that we've seen it more off New York and New Jersey than it's been seen anywhere else. So it really is an enigma. So now, one of my favorite cases is whale number 4, who was first seen in the New York, New Jersey area in 2012. One of the very, very first whales identified, was seen again in 2021 with a little calf alongside her. That calf was given the number 226. Okay. So this was the second time we had ever documented a mother calf pair in our area, but the very first time we had a mother and calf during the summer months, and they stayed here. And we got to see mom and the little calf learning how to feed. We saw them lunge feeding, which was really exciting. Now, remember what I said about those feeding grounds, that the humpback whales exhibit maternal site fidelity. So moms will bring their calves to their feeding ground. So we have no idea why number 4 brought her calf here. But the following year in 2022, guess what? Calf 226 showed up by itself as an independent juvenile feeding on its own, which was amazing. So is this maternal site fidelity that we're seeing? We don't know, but 226 stayed throughout almost the entire feeding season. So we're looking forward to seeing it again this year. So these are a few common behaviors we get to see off New York and New Jersey. We do see pectoral flipper slapping, or peck slapping for short. We see lobtailing, we see fluke slapping, we see breaching. But by far, one of the most dramatic behaviors we get to see is lunge feeding. These are all photos of lunge feeding. This occurs at the surface and we very often see whatever the whales are feeding on jumping out of the water. This is how we know they feed on Atlantic menhaden, and that's a food source for whales here. You can see the menhaden in all these photos if you look closely. Humpback whales do feed below the surface too in our area, but it just depends on where the fish are and what species they're focused on. Now, if you've been paying attention to the news over the last few years, you might have even seen some lunge feeding hitting the headlines. 2 cases that happened in New Jersey, the one up top and the one on the left. So the one up top was a close encounter that fortunately did not affect the boat. But the one on the lower left happened in 2020. And this whale, this vessel actually had to go straight to the beach. It had some damage from a whale that actually lunge fed and landed on the side of the boat and nearly flipped it over. So quite a surprise for those boaters. And then just this past year in the lower right, this is an example from Plymouth, Massachusetts. So not our area, but an example of lunge feeding. So you can see the whale lunge feeding there in the middle of all the boats. And that boat that's right underneath it on the right, it did end up actually landing on top of that boat, rocking it around. Luckily, nobody was hurt, but that was a juvenile humpback whale that was also feeding on Atlantic Menhaden. So lunge feeding can be dangerous for the recreational boaters, like we just saw, but it's a risky behavior for other reasons as well. It's spontaneous. There's often no warning at all. It can put whales directly in front of oncoming ships. This behavior also seems to be most common in juvenile humpback whales close to shore. So these are inexperienced animals. This type of lunge feeding does not seem to be as common on the northern feeding grounds. So part of our work at Gotham Whale is looking at the overlap between our humpback whale sightings and all anthropogenic activities. There are many risks, of course, in our area, but one significant risk is shipping activity. Why are we interested in vessel activity? Because vessel strikes are a #1 cause for whale mortality around the world, especially near major ports. And we have seen many close calls between whales and ships. And unfortunately, we have seen many new injuries and healed over injuries. So this photo is, it's pretty sad, but this is a photo of a whale that actually had part of its flukes severed by a vessel last year. We will be looking very hard to find this whale this year. We're hoping he does return so we can see how this injury healed. And then this photo here always gives me goosebumps because this is our calf. So this is our calf 226 at 1.5 years old, recently weaned, and here trying to navigate through these shipping lanes. So it can be very scary sometimes watching these whales on the water. By looking at areas where there's high overlap between whales and ships, we may gain some insight into the most high-risk areas or potentially where they're being hit. AIS tracking systems are required on most commercial vessels and all vessels over 65 feet. When we plotted our sightings, just a sample of them from 2016 over track data, we found that 95% of sightings were within 100 meters of the track of a vessel carrying AIS. Now, sightings most often overlap with passenger vessels, which means cruise ships and ferries. The Port of New York and New Jersey is a port to several different cruise lines. And in other parts of the world, cruise ships do hit whales pretty often, especially out in Alaska, for example. We also found overlap with tug and tow vessels and some overlap with cargo and tanker vessels, but by far it was the passenger ships. All of these numbers are underestimated since this is all based on just one single sighting. Remember, our whales move around, so they are probably constantly overlapping with many different types of ships. Remember, overlap does not necessarily mean a collision occurred or a mortality occurred. This just means that there are potential areas of risk. Although we do know that humpback whales have been hit by ships in our area, unfortunately, it's almost never reported to anybody. So we can't tell for sure what type of vessel it is or where it's happening. And of course, we're also concerned about wind energy. Wind construction has not begun yet off New Jersey, but it is expected to begin within the next few years. Offshore wind construction involves pile driving, which can generate a lot of underwater noise. Loud sounds like this have been shown to change the distribution of whales temporarily or change their behavior. So it's very important for us to learn as much as we can about their distribution before any construction begins. Now, because Gotham Whale mainly collects data close to shore, it would not be appropriate for us to analyze overlap with offshore wind, but these are two other studies that did. So these two studies found that humpback whales overlapped with multiple types of human activities. For whales inshore, it was mainly shipping lanes and recreational vessel activity. In the map on the lower right, you can see the areas of green and pink. These are recreational and commercial vessel activity. Further offshore, though, there was some overlap with wind energy areas and shipping lanes, but most humpback whale sightings were in areas of minimal activity. So that's these areas of white here that you can see. So that's areas of minimal activity. But that was not the case with all species. So if you look at the map on the left, you can see that there was quite a bit of overlap with North Atlantic right whales in the red and with fin whales in the blue. So entanglements are another event that have been increasing in our area, and that is expected, right? So when there's more whales in an area, there's more chances for entanglement. Whales off New York and New Jersey have been entangled in pot gear, gill nets, trawl gear, and even in the occasional navigational buoy. An important part of Gotham Whale's work is keeping track of any entanglements, making sure that they get reported immediately to response teams. We help to extensively document these events with photographs to support future disentanglement efforts and also future prevention. So the good news is that the amount of whale research off New York and New Jersey has increased dramatically over the last few years. There are now many ongoing and planned research activities. Wind energy companies are also required to put funding into wildlife research, as they should, because they will be constructing in the marine environment. So they should be funding these things. This is great news because previously there was no research funding for whales at all. I've been doing this for 10 years and it has been so difficult to find any kind of funding. There are passive acoustic monitoring buoys in place right now, and there are many more planned specifically to detect whale species in shipping lanes and in wind energy areas. There are also passive acoustic gliders that autonomously travel around the area, detecting whales and collecting environmental data. We are getting closer and closer to real-time detection, which is important for alerting systems. There have also been extensive efforts by the NJDEP to collect as much needed baseline data as they can on whales in our region. Excuse me. So this is an example I just wanted to show you guys. A lot of people don't know about this, but this is the Robots for Whales website. Robots for Whales is a website where it shows the data that is being collected from the passive acoustic monitoring buoys. So this is just a snapshot of one of them. This is the New York Bight Northwest buoy is where the yellow star is, okay? And here are the detections going all the way back to February 28th. So you can see anytime, you can go to it, you could click on it. They want the public to check it out. And you can see what species have been documented in our area. So what immediately speaks to me is on March 5th, there was a potential sei whale detection, which is very cool. Remember I said they're more rare than the other species. So that's super interesting. I highly recommend you check it out. So in conclusion, when it comes to humpback whales, things are changing fast here. They're using the New York Bight more than they used to, and it doesn't appear that they were even here consistently before 1970. There are many risks here, and we need to be prepared for the New York Bight to become part of their regular distribution. We identify between 50 and 90 individuals every year, but what happens when that number keeps going up? We need as much research as possible focused towards humpback whales and other whale species to learn more about them in New York and New Jersey. There are ways that you can help. Advocate for things like better alerting systems for ships when whales are in the area, better enforcement of the speed restrictions on large ships like cruise ships and cargo ships, and educate everyone you know about whales in New York and New Jersey. The more people that know about them, the more awareness there will be out on the water. push for a continuation of the plastic bag ban, a ban of balloon releases, because we don't really talk about it as much anymore, but litter is still a problem, especially when you get closer to the city and you're out on the water. You start to see some crazy things floating out there. And finally, an easy way to help is to submit your sightings to Gotham Whale. It's super simple. You can go on the website, submit when you see a whale, but everything helps us to just learn more about the humpbacks and to track them through our area. So I just want to say thank you to all of the whale watching companies that have contributed to us. It's been an amazing help. We are getting so much data, learning so much. We learn new things every year. And of course, thank you to our many, many citizen scientists that have also contributed their sighting. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Danielle. That was really fascinating. And we have a few questions. Some of them actually I put in here, but I'm going to start with one that we got from Leedy. How long is the feeding season and how do the whales know when to move away from this area?
Ooh, that's a good question. So the feeding season does depend on the feeding ground. So feeding grounds that are further away tend to have a shorter feeding season. But the number one thing that drives their distribution and their movements is the prey. So when the prey moves out, the whales move out too. So that's going to be the primary driver.
Interesting. I was curious, you're talking about entanglement. Who actually goes out there and disentangles the whales? How does that happen?
So there are two main teams in our area. So there is the Center for Coastal Studies is the closest one to us. They are located in Provincetown, Massachusetts. So that's the team that typically comes down to do any disentanglements.
Interesting. So along with that, I was wondering if any of these whales ever are tagged, or maybe you don't need to do that anymore with the sonar detection and all of that.
That's a really good question. So tagging whales does happen around the world. Has not happened in our area yet, but it has been suggested. So tagging whales is not as easy as it sounds. It's incredibly expensive. One tag, for example, can cost $5,000 to $6,000, and that's one tag. So you can imagine that you want to tag a lot of whales. So these projects are just so expensive. So it doesn't happen as often as we'd like it to, but we're hoping it will.
Interesting. So I'm sure this will be of interest to people. Where are the best places along the Jersey Shore to see whales? Are there any particular towns?
Well, you know what? I'm kind of biased because I live at the shore, but I live right near Belmar and I see whales off Belmar all the time. But you really just have to be, you have to be in the right place at the right time, and you have to look. Anytime you're on the beach, make sure you're looking out towards that horizon. I can't tell you how many times that I will be watching a whale even lunge feeding from the beach. And there's people sitting right there on the sand and they have no idea that there's a whale right behind them. So really anywhere along the shoreline, as long as you're looking.
Okay, well, that's good to know because we all travel to all different towns along the shore. What do you think is bringing the humpback whales in greater numbers to this area?
So that's the big question, right? I just said that the primary driver is prey. So we know it's most likely related to prey. We do know that they feed on Atlantic menhaden a lot. And Atlantic menhaden are in abundance right now in our area. There's evidence that that species is also increasing. There's lots of menhaden inside our bays and our estuaries, and we know the whales do follow them in. But keep in mind, humpback whales are opportunistic. So they'll basically feed on any schooling fish species. So Atlantic menhaden are likely not the only species they feed on in our area. We do know that further offshore, they feed on another fish called a sand lance or a sand eel. So we're not exactly sure. It's just one of those complicated questions that we can only guess that it is related to menhaden, but we just don't know.
And last question, is global warming having any impact on whales and where they're going? Is that bringing them here or not bringing them here?
Absolutely, absolutely. So there is evidence that up in the Gulf of Maine, which is the closest main feeding ground to us, the waters are warming very, very quickly. They are starting to see changes in the prey species up there, which actually could be one of the reasons why we're seeing more whales here. Maybe they're being driven out to different areas, but we know we're mainly seeing young whales. So it doesn't completely explain what's happening.
Um, what's the link to the buoy that tells you the whales were
Ah,
recently seen in our area?
I will
Oh, the
share you.
link, I guess, is that
The robots for
website?
whales, the robots
Yeah,
for whales link.
robot.
Absolutely. I can share it in the chat for you guys if you like.
Okay, that would be great.
Yeah.
This was a fabulous introduction to whales, certainly for me. It was really interesting, very fascinating. Thank you so much, Danielle, for being our guest tonight and starting off the year with a great program. We're really pleased. I just want to announce that the next Option Green is going to be on May 17th, and it's going to be about the benefits of green infrastructure. So totally different direction, but still keeping with uh, our mission on education, on conservation. So we hope that we'll see everyone who came tonight. And I want to thank, besides Danielle, I want to thank Melissa Hosick from the library for being our tech person tonight. She always does a great job. And thank everybody, all the attendees. And please join us on our website, join our mailing list at friendsebec.com. And we hope we'll see everybody again. Thank you so much.